Welcome back to Federal Insights, a stronger approach to managing cyber identities and network privileges, sponsored by CyberArk here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Brian Murphy, the Senior Director for Consulting and IR at CyberArk. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And Brian, let's talk about this idea of ID non-repudiation. What is that exactly, and how do you control that so people with full privilege can get re-authenticated during a session, and making sure that people can do exactly what they need to do, but not more than they can need to do in that context of non-repudiation?
That's a good one, Tom. And the non-repudiation, just in definition of itself, basically means whatever is done with an account or on a system, we can tie it back to a user. And the user has no way to say, that wasn't me, that was somebody else. We can prove that was who we say it was on the systems. So we'll start with that little definition there in I guess layman's words, layman's terms. The way we prove this is we do this through strong identification or authentication. And when we have strong authentication in place, what this allows for is us to be able to say there's no other way for someone to log onto a system but George in our example here, because the only way George can log in is he had to use his phone, he had to multi-factor, he had to be in this location, all the controls we talked about earlier on here in order to access the system. And what we found in previous years with privileged accounts, just as a little example here, customers would tell us, I know George was on the system because it had George-admin in the logs. Well, unfortunately, George-admin was just a username password authentication. So we couldn't prove it was George. And then someone else didn't steal his credentials. So this is where the non-repudiation element comes in, is having that strong authentication that no one can refute that George was the one on the system with that account.
So that's where the multi-factor has to be the right factor would help that.
Right.
And for having these solutions that control ID, that control the multi-factor authentication, that make sure kind of people are trafficked the way they should be, and their privileges are trafficked the way they should be, are agencies tending to go to cloud-hosted solutions for this kind of thing? Because cloud introduces another, I guess, set of pathways for data to travel versus hosting these things in their own network operation centers or data centers.
It does, and it's a trade-off, and I don't mean that in a negative way, because the cloud has a lot of benefits to it around the security, the configuration, the alerting that we get from the data. So you're now moving from a small data to a big data type deployment. So for example, with the cloud, if we have all of our identities working through that stack, we can see that, oh, someone's doing this password attack. So now let's make sure that all of the companies that are managed within a single cloud solution don't use that password, or that they're aware of these type of things. Where if we were just on premise or hosting it ourselves, we wouldn't get that same visibility. We wouldn't be alerted on these things. So there's a lot of value add there, but with that value add, there's also risk, because we don't own the infrastructure. We're not taking care of that layer, that if something does happen, it is attacked, someone's able to move around, our data could potentially be exposed, or even our credentials to the systems. So it's something that every agency needs to figure out their appetite for risk. It's not one of those where we can say this is the way all should go to the cloud or all should stay on-prem, because clearly, based on sensitivity is going to drive what our appetite for risk is. Understanding that these are systems, they're written by humans with code. Code is prone to errors. People find ways around it, that we are constantly seeing patching, upgrades, things of that nature have to take place. The last value add I'll give you from the cloud perspective is the hosting provider takes care of the patching for you, and you don't have to do it. And aside from taking the task away from you, what it also does is it keeps customers current, where we may see customers or even agencies here lag 6 months, a year behind to get something deployed. From a patch perspective, it's going to be done automatically when you use the cloud.
Let me ask you something from a different vector here. Everyone is concerned about ransomware, and ransomware has a lot of vectors. You can invoke malware in your system by really sophisticated phishing attacks. And I think in the age of elevated telework, people might be more susceptible to that kind of overture if you get an email that looks, like it's authentic from the outfit, from the organization, the agency, or whatever. But very often, ransomware, that is the taking of data in turn for ransom, is the more accurate way to put it, comes in through standard old-fashioned network hacking. Can any of these tools be employed in such a way that they can detect what looks like a user, but look at it and say, well, this is none of the above in terms of the authentication factors we have for authorized users, and therefore lessen that particular threat?
They can, Tom. I'll say it slightly in a different way. So I
Sure.
definitely know where you're going with this one. Is right now, when we consider access to a system, we consider Brian as Brian the whole way through the process, or Tom as Tom through the process of where you're getting to. When you start looking at ransomware, it's about having different gates. And an example of this is, I'll give you a real example I did probably about a month ago for a public company. And the user went to a website to look up some news, had one of those ads on the side, clicked on the ad, and the ad started a campaign to try to get malware to download to the system, so on and so forth. So how this comes back to is that, it's not just about the identity. They had administrative access. The identity was able to then move to another system without the strong authentication in the identity aspect we're speaking about here, to get to a different system and start the proliferation where they were able to get domain administrative credentials from the organization. This was all done automated. This wasn't something where they were attacking them or looking to get to this company. It was just a drive-by. So this is where identity is not the only source of this, but identity can be the absolute gate, where if we do have that strong authentication, or we say, hey, wait, it doesn't look right that you're accessing this account, or don't use the same account to surf the web that you can access to manage servers, we can put a lot of these controls in place with identity to really help mitigate some of the abilities that ransomware attackers have to get to the networks.
Sure. And I guess my follow-on to that is, you mentioned things that can be intercepted, and you have to be careful of those, email sending of authentication factors and so on. Can any of these systems be configured to detect man-in-the-middle attacks? When you were being eavesdropped at one time on the telephone, you could always hear a little click. A man in the middle in the cyber world, it's very hard sometimes to detect something is going the wrong way and then coming back at you after having been purloined. Can these be used in man in the middle types of situations?
I'm not sure the identity side can do exactly that, Tom. There are absolutely tools that can do this to look for that interception. And CyberArk even has one to do this with the threat analytics. We can say, hey, you're not coming from the same place you were, but you're still trying to access the same resource. So there are ways to do it. From the identity side, the best example of this would probably be like that geolocation, or you're trying to access multiple resources where we prompt you again for the authentication. So the identity element, sticking only to that in this conversation, having that conditional access, that prompt each and every time you do something that doesn't fit the baseline we set for your profile, is really going to be that deterrent from this ransomware attacker really gaining access to other assets within the organization.
Right. And zooming back out, something you mentioned earlier, I want to just follow up on. You talked about ID governance system as kind of a overarching framework in which to look at this whole ID management. What exactly should be the elements of an ID governance system, and how should it be working in an agency?
So the identity governance solutions should be working to identify all the accounts, privileges you have within your agency. We should know what they should have access to, what they shouldn't. As people move around and change roles and responsibilities, the identity should morph with that. Companies that don't have identity governance solutions, you'll actually see that you get this sort of scope creep where you create God accounts because someone moves from job to job to job, and we always add permissions but never remove. And this is what the attackers are looking for: is who's the user that's going to give me the access to the most stuff so that I have less steps to get to the credentials I'm looking for. So when you move into the identity governance suite, a lot of the customers that are doing this with us, if we ask them, how many service accounts do you have? How many people do you have that have this level of permission? You can put in whatever question you want here. they can turn around a report, they can do a recertification process to make sure they know everyone who has that access. But what it also does is it allows you to know if an additional account was created, a rogue account, something random. You can be aware that this is potentially something we need to investigate further because it doesn't follow our governance process.
And this does take you beyond simply directory management then, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
All right. That's great note to close on. Absolutely. Gets you beyond directory management to the whole world of ID governance. I want to thank today's guest. Brian Murphy is the Senior Director for Consulting Services and IR at CyberArk. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search CyberArk.